We've already asked God's blessing. We've asked God to open our eyes and our hearts to receive and believe his word. So let's hear his word. A reading from the book of Ruth, chapter 2. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, "Who does that young woman belong to?" The overseer replied, "She's the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves and behind the harvesters.' She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter." So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after them. Follow along after the women. I've told the men not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you are thirsty, go, get a drink from the water jars that the men have filled." At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland, and you came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord," she said. "You've put me at ease by speaking so kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, Come over here, have some bread, and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some of the roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, "Let her gather among the sheaves, and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work?" Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." She added, "That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." Then Ruth the Moabite said, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished. And she lived with her mother-in-law. This is the word of the Lord. Dear friends of Jesus Christ, as I suggested last week, it's helpful to imagine the book of Ruth as a play, with the various scenes playing out in front of us. The dialogue even sounds like that, right? It sounds like you're reading almost a Shakespeare play or something. Well, this week we come to Act 2 of this beautiful drama, which begins and also ends in the home of Naomi. In chapter 1, the passage we read last week, we got our first glimpse of Ruth's character. We heard in her words, in her speech to her mother-in-law, a portrait of devotion. Devotion to her mother-in-law, and devotion to her mother-in-law's people, and devotion to her mother-in-law's God. Do you remember? Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. What Ruth is doing is speaking words of covenant faithfulness. The word in Hebrew for covenant faithfulness is chesed. Can I ask you to say that? Chesed. It's like, I don't really speak Dutch, but I know in Dutch you don't say gezellig, you say gezellig, right? You have to do the same with chesed, okay? One more time, chesed. The words of faith in God and faithfulness to humans that Ruth spoke, those words of chesed, had an effect. They were enough to silence the bitter complaints of Ruth's Israelite mother-in-law, Naomi. Ruth sounds more like an Israelite than Naomi does. She sounds the way an Israelite should sound. She speaks words of faith in Israel's covenant God, even though she's a Moabite. Now in Act 2, we begin to see that Ruth doesn't just express chesed with her words. She puts her faith into faithful action. Ruth doesn't just sound like an Israelite. She acts like an Israelite, like a person whose character has been shaped by God's law, by the Torah of Israel's covenant God. Ruth acts like a true Israelite. That's what we see as chapter 2 of this drama unfolds. We notice a contrast throughout the first half of Ruth between Naomi and Ruth. It starts in chapter 1, Act 1, and it extends into Act 2, where the focus is less on what the characters say and more on what they do. Naomi, daughter of Israel, doesn't do very much, as it turns out. Naomi's withdrawn. She's despondent. I say that not to pass judgment on her character. She's overwhelmed. She's still in the funk of the sorrow that she has experienced. She's still grieving her loss. She's what we would probably call today depressed. She only shows a casual interest in Ruth and what Ruth proposes. She doesn't even seem to mind at the beginning, though she starts to wake up to it at the end, that going out alone into the fields of Israel could be dangerous. She doesn't seem too concerned about those risks at the beginning of the chapter. Go ahead, my daughter. She barely lifts her hand to say goodbye. At least the one thing is she doesn't complain. Go ahead. I'll just sit here because the Lord's hand has gone out against me. She doesn't, like, she's moving out of that. But she still hasn't received the healing and restoration that she needs. She hasn't begun to move out of her grief. Ruth has almost as many reasons to complain as Naomi. She's lost a husband too. She doesn't have any more secure a future to look forward to than Naomi does. And she has maybe one extra reason to feel sorry for herself. She's left her homeland behind. She's left her family of origin behind. She's now living as a stranger in a strange land. And she's just fresh from the journey from Moab to Israel. But she doesn't take any time to recover. She doesn't pay attention to the risks that she might expose herself to. She just goes out to work wherever she can so that she can provide for herself and for her mother-in-law, Naomi. Ruth is the one who acts in Act 2 of this drama. So the story follows her actions. It goes where she goes. The spotlight stays on her. And pretty soon, Ruth finds herself in a field belonging to a man named Boaz. We get that foreshadowing at the beginning of Act 2. We're briefly introduced to him. He's from the same clan as Elimelech, Naomi's dead husband. But even though Boaz has just walked onto the stage, he makes his entrance here early in Act 2 with a kind of a liturgical call and response. The Lord be with you. That's where we get this liturgy, from the book of Ruth. The Lord be with you. And it's not quite and also with you, but it's the Lord bless you. Boaz has this kind of effect on the people whose lives his life touch. But even though Boaz walks onto the stage and makes his big entrance, the spotlight kind of stays on Ruth, and even Boaz's attention goes to Ruth, like zeroes right in on her. Why is that? Is it because Ruth is young and attractive? Maybe she is, but that seems so Hollywood. And nothing in the story tells us anything about Ruth's youth or attractiveness. Nothing in the text suggests she's beautiful. Or is it that Boaz just notices her because she's such a hard worker? That's possible, though I'm pretty sure that's not either. The most obvious answer is, first of all, she's different. She's a foreigner. She's a stranger. Strangers stand out. You go to a church for the first time. People might not say anything to you, but they know you're not from this congregation. Boaz wants to know, who is this? But notice how he asks the question. Not who is this, but who does that young woman belong to? And here's what his question really means. How does she fit in to this community? Where does she belong? What's her place in Israel? What standing does she have? Who is she connected to? And this is where things get really interesting, because in fact Ruth doesn't really have any standing. She's a widow with no property. She's only attached in any meaningful way to one person, and that's another widow who has no property and no standing, and no one to give her standing, no guardian, redeemer, no husband, just a widow, and that was nothing. Footnote, that's why God said you have to be particularly attentive to widows and orphans in their distress, because they're people who don't have anyone else to give them the standing that they need. I'm not saying that's an absolute value. The way women were marginalized in ancient Israelite and other ancient societies is not a good thing. It's not how God wants things to be, but it's how it was. And besides being a widow, as I mentioned, Ruth is a foreigner. It's the first thing the overseer points out. Oh, she's the Moabite. So here she is, a widowed daughter-in-law of a widow without any property, no husband, no father, no children, and she's a foreigner. That puts Ruth about as far down the Israelite social ladder as you could get. If there's a negative value, she's kind of into the negative numbers. And Ruth herself is very aware of that. And so is everyone else. And with all that in mind, Ruth's behavior is pretty amazing. She's not just industrious and hardworking. She's kind of bold and brazen. She steps out where she doesn't really have the standing to step out. She doesn't come into the fields a few days after the harvest is finished to see if maybe there's something left, because that was the law. It wasn't give some of the grain to the poor. It was leave some so that they can come later and pick it up. Not Ruth. She wants to follow along right behind the reapers while they're still reaping. She could have been chased away. She probably had to face some sass when she first started. She dares to ask for something even though she's a nothing. She wants to be treated as if she actually does have standing. That is because she has faith, because chesed means faith and faithfulness. She trusts God and she acts on that faith. She believes that Israel's God will take care of her, and that Israel, the community of faith that has gathered, will be a community of goodness. And that's the thing that impressed Boaz. It impresses enough, and that's his speech, right? I have heard about you. Now that I know who you are, you're the Ruth I've heard all about. It's been told to me how you've shown faithfulness, how you've left your people, how you've thrown in your lot with Israel's God. So he not only grants her request, but he gives her even more special treatment. He includes her in the koinonia of the covenant community. Stay here. Glean with my women, not behind them, with them. Drink from the water jars that my men have filled. Usually it's the women who serve the men. Let the men serve you. Sit down and eat. Join us at the table. Share the bread and the wine with us. Yes, these are actions that meet human need. But they are also gestures that symbolize God's blessing and fellowship and inclusion in the covenant community, even though you're a foreigner. So as Act 2 unfolds, Ruth sort of gains standing before our eyes, not through a relationship with another person so much as through her own character. But she also gains standing in the eyes of Boaz. He's even more impressed meeting her in person than hearing about her through the buzz in the community. And as for Ruth, she arrives on the scene empty. But when she leaves, she's been filled to the point of overflowing. That's one of the great themes of the book of Ruth, from emptiness to fullness. So Ruth surely hoped to receive something for her efforts. I think she even believed that she would, but I doubt she expected to be as blessed as she was. Her question to Boaz seems to express genuine surprise and wonder. Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me a foreigner. Like that might sound like the ancient version of thanks, you're welcome. Just politeness. But Ruth's question also points us, the audience. Ruth is always very conscious of having an audience, the faith community, pointing us, directing our attention towards Israel's God, who never is on the scene visibly, but is always the main actor in the book, in the drama. God is the one who's blessing his people in ways that they could never have imagined and never could have accomplished for themselves. Ruth asks Boaz, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes?" And favor, that's another Hebrew word that you have to have that throat sound for. Chen means favor. And sometimes it's translated as grace. Why have I found such favor in your eyes? But it's really in God's eyes that Ruth has found favor. And Boaz's answer confirms that. He doesn't just answer Ruth's question, "I'll tell you why you found favor in my eyes." He actually adds an explicit blessing. "I know what you did. I know that you threw in your lot with Israel's God. I know that you put your future in Yahweh's hands. So may you find favor in this God's eyes. May Yahweh, may the Lord, may Israel's God repay and reward you. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." And remember that phrase for next week, under whose wings. It will be important. Ruth's response to Boaz's blessing is also very interesting. He says, "May you find favor in God's eyes." Yes. But may I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord. Not Lord as in the name of God, but just my master. Sir, may I continue to find favor in your eyes. So often in this book of Ruth, because it's so cleverly written, the words people speak turn out to be far more significant and prophetic than we realize. How lovely for the audience if Ruth's reward from the Lord, finding favor in the eyes of the Lord, and finding favor in the eyes of Boaz, turn out to be the same thing. The favor of Boaz. Could there be a better reward for Ruth, the widow? Or a better way for her to experience the favor of the Lord than by continuing to find favor in the eyes of Boaz? But is that going to happen? Will Boaz continue to show favor to Ruth? And will he become the channel of God's favor to Ruth? And what will that look like? We have to hang in there for 2 more chapters to find out for sure. But this is the possibility that makes Naomi start to come alive again as the scene shifts in Act 2, back to Naomi's house, as the action comes back to where it began. Naomi recognizes that Ruth has been extraordinarily blessed when she sees the amazing amount of food that Ruth brings home. Some of it already cooked and ready to eat that day, but also an ephah. Anyone know how much an ephah is? It's probably like half a bushel, I think. I'm going to have to fact check myself on that. But there's a story where they keep an omer of manna in a jar in the Ark of the Covenant, so people can remember that. And that's about enough for one person for one day. And then it says an omer is 1/10 of an ephah. So there's almost about a week's worth of food, plus an extra meal that Ruth is bringing home. But there's more to it than just the food. Naomi begins to dream about a particular way in which a better and a more permanent blessing might come. That man Boaz from the clan of my husband, from the clan of Elimelech, is a close relative. He's one of our guardian redeemers. And I'll say more about what a guardian redeemer is next week, but I need to keep you in a little bit of suspense. But the unspoken thought in Naomi's mind, in Naomi's heart, is I wonder if this man Boaz's action might bring about God's blessing and God's redemption into my life. That's where the curtain falls on Act 2. It's intermission. There's no resolution to the question. In fact, the harvest is coming to an end. There's a little bit of anxiety. Ruth is still living in the home of her mother-in-law. And if the story ends there, it's not very satisfying. Their immediate needs have been met, but it's not yet the fullness that they desire. It's not permanent. It's not the rest that Naomi wished for her daughters-in-law. It's not a new day, a new standing, a new lasting security. And above all, it's not the assurance of a future in the form of a husband and in the form of a son, in the form of an heir, in the form of an offspring to carry on the family name and secure the presence of the family in the covenant community, the intergenerational community of God's redeemed people. That was so important to people in biblical times, as I mentioned last week. This is not yet, and they all lived happily ever after. We're still waiting for that. But Ruth hits the pause button here as the drama plays out before our eyes. We can reflect on that. We're supposed to reflect on this. We're supposed to feel this like an intermission. So let me offer you just a few reflections on this book so far. Some different angles of view that the story offers us. First, let's focus for a moment on Naomi. We've stayed with Ruth, and the action does stay with Ruth, but it never really loses sight of Naomi either. Naomi's not the main character, but she's an important part of the story. She's the person who's been traumatized by life in this broken world, and she needs redemption. In this chapter, in this act we just witnessed this morning, Naomi is changed. She's taken a step. God's led her a step towards restoration and healing. She has one of the most important lines in the book when she says, Yahweh, or the Lord, has not stopped showing his kindness, chesed, to the living and the dead. Because that's where she was at the end of Act 1. The Lord's hand has gone out against me. Don't call me Naomi, which means pleasant. Call me Mara, which means bitter. No, the Lord's not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. God is still working in my life. It's not just a confession of faith. God is a God of faithfulness, chesed. It's a personal realization. And we always need to make that connection. We have a faith that we have inherited and that we participate in, but we have to make it personal. It's not just that God is faithful. You have to experience and trust God's faithfulness to me. God has not abandoned me. We have to be able to say that. And sometimes it's hard to say that in the midst of bleak circumstances. And maybe you can see yourself in Naomi, and maybe you can see yourself more in Naomi of chapter 1. The Naomi who's only got the loss that she's experienced in her heart. But God has not stopped showing kindness to you. God is not finished with the redemptive work yet. That's what this book is conveying to us. That's what God is showing us through the story of Naomi. And second, Naomi's turnaround comes mainly, of course, because of God's faithfulness. But the instrument of God's faithfulness is a human being. Naomi's turnaround comes through another person's act of faithfulness, because of another person's sustained faithfulness to her over time, because of another person's, say the word, chesed. We're called not just to be to have a God of faithfulness, but to be people of faithfulness, to embody God's character in our lives. And maybe that's a role you can play in another person's life. Maybe there is a person near you that needs to experience chesed, and maybe you're the person that God has put in a position to do that. You know, that's one of the most wonderful things that can happen to a human being. I mean, I don't want to blow my own horn, but I want to just tell you one thing that happened to me. I went to visit Sandy, who lives in the same building as Gerda, last week, and I looked at my list and I read apartment 306, and that turns out to be Gerda's apartment, and I meant to go to Sandy's apartment. And I walked in on Gerda. I knocked on the doors. He said, "Come in." And, this isn't where I meant to be. But it's where God meant me to be. Because Gerda said, "I'm so happy to see you. I have had such a terrible week." And she told, I'm not going to share the whole story with you. You can call her if you want to. But it was such a blessing. You ever have that experience? You walk in and someone says, "I'm so happy to see you." And you guess God, what's that slogan or that verse from the Bible that's right over the archway as you walk into the sanctuary? God has prepared good works for us, right? I got to just put one of those on like a jacket this week. It was good. Maybe if you walk around with your eyes open, sometimes you see those good works just waiting for you to try them on. Third, this happens within the faith community, Israel. And in that community, people are all over the place spiritually. Like some of them are attuned to the liturgy and the life of the community. The Lord be with you. The Lord bless you. And it's all sweet. But there are also widows being neglected in that same Israel. There are men that have to be told not to molest women. There are women that are in danger when they walk through the streets of Israel. And it's the same in our world, right? Some of the people in the covenant community are just bystanders to the suffering of others. Some might even be harmful to others. Many people experience the church not as a community of health, but as a community of harm. We're still broken. We can't accept that, but we have to acknowledge it. Boaz says, don't reprimand her, don't speak harshly to her, don't harass her. We need to be a safe church that loves people. But some people in this community, by their acts of faithfulness, by their alertness to God's will, by their embodiment of God's character, bring healing and blessing to others. They make the whole community better. They advance God's small and great purposes. And in this story, what Ruth does isn't just helping her mother-in-law, Naomi. It's helping us. Are you aware of that? The promise to Abraham that God, through your offspring, will bring blessing to all the nations of the earth will not go forward unless Ruth shows faithfulness to Naomi, and unless Boaz shows faithfulness to Elimelech's clan. This is what's unfolding in the story. This story plugs into the story of God's redeeming the whole world, of what happens in Bethlehem 1,000 years later. And you'll find the name Ruth in the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, along with Abraham's and along with 3 other women in Matthew's genealogy. You never know how widely your small acts of faithfulness will advance God's great acts of faithfulness. As we read the book of Ruth, we see things that are small but still amazing happening in Bethlehem. But God is preparing something much bigger in Bethlehem. He's preparing to enter the world as one of us, beginning with a humble birth in Bethlehem. God is preparing to empty himself and make himself nothing for our sake in a saving and sacrificial act. But he's also setting an example for us. And Jesus, we heard from John 13 just a few weeks ago. Jesus got down on his knees and washed his disciples' feet as a symbol of his sacrifice. And then he said, now that I, your teacher of Lord, have done this for you, you ought to do this. You must do this for one another. And now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. So yes, we need to trust Jesus. And yes, we need to adore Jesus, but we also need to imitate Jesus and embody his love. God's grace intends to remake us in the image of Jesus, both individually and as a community. And if we are his followers, we must each and all together become more like him. And if we are his body, then we must be guided and directed by him as our head and our heart. Next week, we'll celebrate the Lord's Supper. We'll come to the Lord's table. We'll remember these things. And as we remember and remind ourselves and come to know these things, we will be blessed if we do them, because we are called to be people of chesed. Say it. Chesed. Join me in prayer. Oh God, you are a God of steadfast love and faithfulness. Chesed ve'emet. We adore you for that. We adore you forever. Forever, every creature that you have redeemed and created and redeemed, will say, you are worthy. Because you created all things, and by your will they exist and were created. And they will say to you, Lord Jesus, you are worthy, for by your blood, by your faithful obedience, by your sacrifice, you have redeemed for God people from every race and tribe and nation and tongue, and made them to be a kingdom, priests to serve their God and Father forever. And they will reign on the earth. That means we must be formed in your image, Jesus Christ. That we must follow the example of Ruth and the greater example of you yourself. And make sure that our lives are not just for ourselves, but they are lives of love for others. Thank you that that is your life. You define yourself by your steadfast love and faithfulness, by your outreaching love. And we pray that you will help us to bear your image and the image of your Son. We ask these things in his name. Amen.